Why did Mike Tomlin shut down a question about Shadour Sanders? Like it was never supposed to be asked? It wasn't aggressive, but it was clear. His answer was a wall. No smile, no reflection, just a hard stop. And instantly, that cold response rewrote months of speculation. Because this wasn't just any quarterback. This was the same kid Pittsburgh reportedly sat down with, praised, studied, and maybe even considered on draft night. Until they didn't. They passed. Not once. Not twice. 5 separate chances, and every time they looked the other way. So what changed? He had the talent. He had the tools. He had the meeting with the head coach himself. Yet when it counted, the Steelers backed off. And now Tomlin won't say why. This isn't just a draft day mystery anymore. It's something deeper. A story about perception, silence, and a rising quarterback who's now staring straight across the field at the team that turned their back without explanation. This is what happens when belief is temporary and receipts get paid under the lights. It didn't start with speculation or fan theories. The connection between Shadour Sanders and the Pittsburgh Steelers was real. It existed quietly, long before the first name was called on draft night, and it wasn't built on hype. It was built through meetings, evaluations, direct questions, and real face-to-face time. Not every player gets that. And not every organization sends its head coach to sit in on those conversations. But in this case, Mike Tomlin did exactly that. No delegation, no layers of middlemen. Tomlin was in the room asking the questions himself. He wasn't there to smile for the cameras or check a box, he was locked in. Film was rolled, schemes were discussed. Tomlin wanted to know how Sanders saw the field, how he read defenses, how he adjusted under pressure. These weren't surface-level questions. They were designed to probe a quarterback's mind, to test how he processes chaos, and whether he has the mental toughness to survive the professional game. And apparently, Sanders passed those tests. Publicly, Tomlin said the meeting was productive. In coach speak, that word carries weight. It's not a throwaway term. Productive means things went smoothly. No drama, no flags, no second thoughts. The kind of meeting coaches walk away from thinking, we could work with this guy. And Tomlin didn't stop there. He went further, complimenting Sanders on the very things most young quarterbacks struggle to prove: competitiveness, toughness, command. Those kinds of traits don't show up in combined stats. They don't flash on highlight reels. They come through in the way someone walks into a room, how they answer hard questions, how they carry themselves when every word is being measured. And for Tomlin, who spent decades around alpha personalities, from veterans to rookies to kids carrying Hall of Fame last names, Sanders showed enough. At least that's what it looked like. And that's what made everything that followed so confusing. From the outside, this looked like a fit. It had all the typical markers. The Steelers needed young competition in the quarterback room. Sanders offered upside, pedigree, and poise under pressure. Tomlin himself had spoken highly of second-generation players, guys who grew up around the game. He understood that edge, that natural familiarity with the spotlight. He'd coached players like that before. And with Deion Sanders, Coach Prime being Shadur's father, you'd think that might add baggage. But if anything, it added context. Tomlin made it crystal clear. This evaluation wasn't about Deion, it was about Shadour. His film, his demeanor. His ability to transition from college to the league mentally. This wasn't a marketing stunt. It was serious football discussion. And if you were watching from a distance, you could be forgiven for assuming that some kind of green light was coming. Because when a respected coach talks that positively about a quarterback, especially publicly, it usually means something. NFL teams don't play games when it comes to draft boards. Interest doesn't get leaked unless it exists. Teams don't burn front office hours unless a player actually has a chance. And when that player is a quarterback, someone who would inevitably become a face of the franchise, you double-check every angle. And in Sanders' case, the boxes seemed checked. The visit happened. The tone was positive. Tomlin didn't sidestep the topic when asked, but things shifted, and quickly. When draft night came, Pittsburgh held all the leverage. They had flexibility, option after option. Quarterback still on the board, Sanders still waiting. And then they passed. The first time didn't feel like a red flag. Maybe they had someone higher on the board. But then came the second pass. Then the third, the fourth, the fifth. Each one widened the space between evaluation and action. And with each pick, the praise from earlier months started to feel hollow. No press release, no follow-up quotes. No, we went another direction from Tomlin. No insiders whispering about concerns. Just total, deliberate silence, which is rare. NFL teams are strategic with what they leak and when. If a meeting goes south, word gets around fast, usually through well-connected reporters. Negative traits magically surface in the media to temper expectations. But none of that happened here. Nobody from Pittsburgh even indirectly questioned Sanders' readiness, personality, or ceiling. If anything, their silence became suspicious in itself. And that's where people started piecing together what wasn't said. There was no indication the meeting had gone badly. No reporting of issues behind the scenes. Nothing that would realistically explain why the Steelers looked away 5 times from a player their head coach had admired just weeks earlier. Which leaves only 2 conclusions. Either something happened internally that was never made public, a red flag that Pittsburgh buried deep and chose not to comment on, or the team simply didn't see enough to commit, despite the compliments. But both theories only make sense if you accept a hard truth about the NFL. Words don't build careers. Decisions do. Everything Tomlin said before the draft was real, but respect doesn't always equal action. And that's the gap that fans, analysts, and even Sanders himself were left staring into. Because when one of the most stable, vocal coaches in the NFL publicly acknowledges a quarterback's intangibles, only to walk away without a trace or an explanation, it's not just disappointing. It's perplexing. And in silence, stories start writing themselves. Draft night didn't explode into chaos for Shadour Sanders. It didn't spiral into embarrassment or headlines. Those moments are obvious. What happened was quieter but louder in its own way. Sanders sat and waited. Teams made their picks. His name wasn't called, and most people watching didn't panic, not at first. Not when it was still early. Not when there was still plenty of time. Then Pittsburgh came on the clock. This was the team everyone had been watching. Whispers around the league had linked Shadour to the Steelers for weeks. Analysts had floated it, insiders had alluded to it, even Tomlin himself had helped fuel the conversation with public praise. This was supposed to be one of the best fits, a stable franchise, a coach who understood young quarterbacks, and a system that could let him grow. But instead of pulling the trigger, Pittsburgh passed. Not dramatically, not loudly, just moved on. And again, people didn't freak out. Maybe they didn't expect him to go in that exact spot. Maybe Pittsburgh had a different plan, a player hire on their internal board, a trade opportunity, a different kind of need. But then they came up again and passed again. At 2 passes, people started asking questions. At 3, it got uncomfortable. By the 5th time the Steelers were on the clock, the moment had transformed entirely. Because this wasn't just a missed opportunity, it was a series of conscious decisions. 5 different chances. 5 different evaluations. And 5 times, Pittsburgh looked at Sanders and said no thanks. That doesn't happen by accident. That's not something a team shrugs off later. That's a pattern. And not once during those 5 passes was it clear what changed. There were no obvious, can't-miss players being taken instead. No desperation grabs for need-filling positions. Most of Pittsburgh's picks were solid, steady, the kind of choices teams make when they're thinking long-term. But none of them were quarterbacks. And at no point did they circle back to the guy they had once sat down with and praised for his mindset, poise, and upside. And what really stirred the conversation wasn't just that they passed. It was that they never explained why. In the NFL, teams are constantly spinning narratives around their draft boards. Whether it's through subtle leaks to insiders or carefully worded press conference sound bites, franchises usually make a point to say something, especially when buzz has already built around a player. If a meeting went badly, word would leak. If a prospect came off badly in interviews, it would ripple through media channels within days. But with Sanders, there was nothing. No red flags, no background whispers, no quiet character concerns attached to his name, at least not from Pittsburgh. In fact, if anything, their silence was louder than any leaked complaint could have ever been. Because when a team praises a player publicly, then passes on him repeatedly without comment, people don't sit quietly. They fill in the blank space. That's where rumors take root. That's where narratives start forming. And Pittsburgh gave them a wide open field to grow in. Fans immediately looked back at everything they'd been told just weeks earlier about how Tomlin respected Sanders' toughness, how the film session went well, how the meeting was productive, focused, normal. So if there wasn't a red flag, not one the public knew about, what justified 5 passes? And that's when the conversation shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't about where Sanders would go. It was about why Pittsburgh went cold. Maybe they planned to take him later and someone else jumped in first. Maybe they thought he'd drop further and they gambled wrong. Maybe they liked him, just not enough. Plausible theories, but with zero confirmation, they remain just that, theories. And in the NFL, speculation doesn't sit still for long. It turns fast, into headlines, into brand damage, into perception, and perception is everything for a young quarterback on the edge of beginning their career. But here's the thing that kept bothering people. It just didn't line up. The Steelers weren't boxed into a corner. They had the flexibility. They had the room. It wasn't like they were sitting behind a franchise quarterback locked into a 10-year deal. They were in that uncertain space, looking for answers at the most crucial position in football. All the more reason why Sanders felt like a viable, even smart bet. But 5 rounds passed. 5 names were called, none of them his. By the time the dust settled, Sanders had a team, it just was Pittsburgh. No statements came out. No interviews clarified what had unfolded. Tomlin didn't speak on it again. The story just hung there, suspended in silence. If he knew something, he wasn't saying it. If he regretted something, he didn't share it. And when coaches with his stature choose not to engage, people notice. Because Tomlin's not the kind of coach who gets flustered by hard questions. He knows exactly how much to say and when to say nothing at all. The longer he stayed quiet, the more that silence sounded like a statement. And in a league as cutthroat and calculated as the NFL, people don't assume silence means nothing. They assume it means everything. And that's why this wasn't just a missed pick. It was a moment. One that's still being unpacked, not by the Steelers, not by Tomlin, but by everyone else trying to understand what went wrong between the team that once praised Shadour Sanders and then vanished when the moment to believe arrived. Right after the draft ended, the questions didn't fade, they multiplied. It didn't take long for the silence out of Pittsburgh to be drowned out by the loudest voice in modern sports culture, the internet. If teams won't offer answers, then fans, insiders, and armchair analysts will create their own. That's the rule now. And in the days that followed, the narrative around Shadour Sanders started to drift, then spin. First came the whispers. Tiny, unsourced claims floating across social media, posted by pages with just enough credibility to stir doubt, but never enough to prove anything. Some teams weren't thrilled with his interviews. Maybe he came off too confident. He rubbed some people the wrong way. They weren't tied to anything specific. No scout went on record. No insider dropped a concrete detail. No report named Pittsburgh directly. But as more people saw those posts, something strange happened. Doubt with no evidence started feeling like reality. This is how NFL narratives are born, not from fact, but from a gap. A gap between expectation and outcome, between what we were told earlier and what didn't make sense later. Shadour Sanders was a quarterback that Mike Tomlin had openly praised. He'd gone through a detailed sit-down that, by all accounts, had gone well. No team statements, no leaked red flags, no draft night drama. Just a promising player being passed up repeatedly with no explanation to match. And that space, that empty space, is where rumors love to live. Within days, those whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were threads, then videos, then full-on breakdowns from influencers and YouTubers speculating what went wrong. Maybe he was arrogant. Maybe his father's influence complicated things. Maybe the Steelers were never that serious to begin with and kept it friendly for optics. All of it theoretical. None of it sourced, but it didn't matter. When you're young, talented, and silent, people fill the silence for you. What made it all even messier was the direct contradiction between the rumors and what Mike Tomlin had already said. He didn't walk back his previous statements. He described the pre-draft meeting as normal, productive. He'd gone out of his way to highlight Sanders' toughness and competitive edge, traits coaches don't casually throw around during evaluations. He didn't need to say those things during interviews, but he did, willingly. So if those rumors were true, why did they clash so violently with everything we'd already heard? And more importantly, if something had gone wrong behind closed doors, why did Tomlin just say so? That's what fans kept circling back to. If he had even hinted that a red flag popped up, people would have moved on. They would have understood. NFL teams pass on prospects all the time because of complicated fits, uncomfortable conversations, or subtle locker room concerns. But he didn't do that. Instead, Tomlin stayed consistent. The meeting was about football. It was respectful. It was normal. Still, the rumors grew. And as they grew, so did the frustration. Was confidence now being misread as ego? Was Sanders being penalized for the attention he naturally drew as day and sun? Was the media spotlight around him being misinterpreted as immaturity? Once those questions entered the ecosystem, they spread like wildfire. Twitter threads turned into Reddit theories, which turned into podcast debates. all based on nothing concrete. But again, it didn't need to be proven. It just needed to feel plausible. That's what people forget about perception in the NFL. It doesn't matter whether something actually happened. It matters whether people believe it could have. And the most dangerous part of this post-draft spiral wasn't that a few fans started pushing theories. It's that major media outlets didn't stop them. Nobody from Pittsburgh stepped in to clarify the team's stance. No anonymous source jumped in to correct the record. They let the story drift. And in pro sports, drift is deadly. You let a false narrative breathe, and suddenly, it's standing in the room like fact. By the time the dust settled, Sanders was already carrying a stigma he never truly earned. Not because of anything he did, but because no one stopped the conversation from twisting into places it was never meant to go. And that silence from Pittsburgh, it wasn't neutral anymore. It started to feel intentional. And when that happens, people draw conclusions, fair or not. Mike Tomlin had the power to kill the narrative. One sentence, one quote, one clarification. But that never came. And for a coach who has always been calculated, composed, and precise with his words, that raised an even bigger question. Was this just business, or was there more behind the scenes that we'll never get to hear? Because when a respected coach praises a player publicly, speaks highly about his character, studies him, evaluates him personally, and then walks away without explanation, it's never as simple as we went another way. Not in the NFL. Not when the league is built on information, secrets, and spin. And so, the image of Shadour Sanders started to quietly shift. Not based on facts, not based on play, based solely on what wasn't said. And once that happens, once a player's reputation becomes shaped more by assumption than performance, it takes a lot more than potential to correct course. Weeks passed. The rumors kept swirling, the silence from Pittsburgh held firm, and the narrative was starting to harden. But just when the story might have started to fade, it flared back to life, all because of one moment in front of a microphone. Mike Tomlin was asked a straightforward question: what has he seen from Shadour Sanders lately? It could have been an easy answer. He's progressing well. He's a talented young player. A safe, polished comment meant to leave no fingerprints. Coaches do that all the time. Say something positive, move on fast, give no story legs, but Tomlin didn't choose that path. He didn't attack Sanders, he didn't criticize him, he did something far more deliberate. He shut it down tight, cold, clean, not rude, not personal, but unmistakably distant. I haven't looked at it through that lens. His growth is not my charge. We're preparing to compete against him. That was it. 3 sentences, dry, final, walls up. And just like that, people stopped talking about the draft, about fit, about potential. Instead, all attention shifted to tone. Because anyone who's watched Tomlin over the years knows how intentional his communication is. He doesn't waste phrases. He's not careless with his answers, especially when the spotlight is burning. Whatever he says, public or private, usually has a reason behind it. And in this case, the reason didn't feel like strategy. It felt like a boundary. From the moment those words left his mouth, analysts dissected every beat. There was no, we liked what we saw back then. No, I'm rooting for the kid. No effort to soften the conversation. Tomlin simply refused to participate in the narrative at all. Whatever had happened pre-draft, all those meetings, the evaluation, the praise, it was clearly in the past. Frozen. That wasn't indifference. That was dismissal. Not of Sanders' talent, but of responsibility. Because if Tomlin was ever interested in Sanders, those days were gone. He drew a hard line between the man he met before the draft and the quarterback standing across from him now. And that line said everything. To some, it came off as professionalism. A coach refusing to comment on another team's player. Fair enough. The NFL is full of that kind of quiet code. But to others, it read differently, like intentional emotional distance. A signal, don't ask me about this again. That chapter's closed. The shift was undeniable. Months earlier, Tomlin was on record praising Sanders' intangibles. His leadership, toughness, the kind of qualities most coaches obsess over. Now, that same coach couldn't offer a single word of analysis on his growth. That silence wasn't random. And when someone with Tomlin's authority chooses not to engage, people hear that just as loudly as if he'd gone on a 5-minute explanation. Because silence from a figure like him isn't passive. It's strategic. And in this case, it turned a small interview clip into something much bigger. It reframed the whole situation. Before, people saw the Steelers' draft day silence as a strategy choice. Now it looked personal, measured, as if Pittsburgh never saw Sanders as part of the plan, no matter what they said at the time, and now had zero interest in revisiting that choice, defending it, or even acknowledging it. which made the question even heavier. If everything during the pre-draft process was, in Tomlin's own words, productive, why the cold shoulder now? Even if they decided to go in another direction, why not wish him well? Why not offer a simple acknowledgement of the journey? Instead, it was as if Sanders never existed in Pittsburgh's draft room at all. For most players, that moment might have slipped by. But not here, not with Shadour Sanders, not after the coverage, not after the speculation, and definitely not when the meeting with Tomlin had been a central part of the pre-draft story. Because when the same coach who once praised your mindset won't even comment on your progress, the message hits different. It's not disrespect, it's detachment. And that's arguably worse. Tomlin didn't try to shape the narrative. He didn't try to clear it up. He chose to erase himself from the story entirely. And that says more than any official statement ever could. No denial, no confirmation, just a carefully designed emotional firewall. And that kind of silence doesn't protect someone. It exposes them not by what's said, but by what's very clearly being avoided. To fans, that moment confirmed the gap they suspected. Somewhere between the meeting and the draft, something closed the door between Sanders and the Steelers permanently. What that something is, we may never know. But Tomlin's answer didn't just distance himself. It distanced the franchise from the praise, from the relationship, and from the evaluation. And in the NFL, that means everything. Because actions and inaction always speak louder than words. The most difficult part of being passed on isn't the silence. It's what the silence leaves behind. After all the meetings, the conversation, the praise, watching a team go another direction is hard. But watching them act like none of it ever happened, that leaves a different kind of mark. Because what happened between Shadour Sanders and the Pittsburgh Steelers highlights the kind of double silence players fear most. The silence before a decision and the silence after. Mike Tomlin didn't owe Sanders a spot on the roster. This league is too competitive, too cutthroat, too calculated for sentiment to get in the way of strategy. That's part of the game. Every team has a board, a vision, a process designed to serve only one thing, themselves. But when you've praised a player in public, sat down in the room with him, praised his mindset, and later you walk away without acknowledgement, there's something about that kind of distance that stings deeper than a clean rejection. Because rejection is honest. What happened here wasn't honesty. It was ambiguity. A kind of vague detachment that seemed to say, we liked you, but not enough to say why we don't believe in you now. And in a league where reputation is currency, that's one of the most damaging places a player can find themselves in, stuck between admiration and abandonment. From Sanders' perspective, it's not just that he wasn't drafted by Pittsburgh. It's that they showed interest, said the right things, gave signals that felt real. And then vanished. Quietly, decisively, without offering a single explanation. For a young quarterback trying to carve out space in a league that already doubts most of them, that kind of silence isn't neutral. It leaves scars, because draft night isn't just about where you're selected. It's about which team is willing to put their name, their future, their belief behind you when it matters most. 5 chances came and went. Not once did Pittsburgh reach out and make that investment. And when the chance came to frame it, to explain it, to give a player like Sanders some context, they passed again. Tomlin didn't attack him. He didn't call him immature, didn't question his readiness. He simply put up a wall and walked away from the narrative altogether. It wasn't malice, but it was distant, clinical, controlled, designed to say, that's not our responsibility anymore. But here's the thing. In the NFL, respect and responsibility can't be separated so cleanly. If you respect a player's toughness, his leadership, his presence and poise in interviews, if you say that out loud for millions to hear, then you bear part of the weight when that player is later defined by the noise you refuse to address. Because in this league, the truth doesn't need confirmation to take hold. All it needs is space. And silence creates a lot of space. It wasn't just that Pittsburgh passed, it's how they passed. They didn't signal red flags, didn't leak negative reports, didn't prepare the media for an eventual no. Everything stayed positive until they were on the clock. Then, without a sound, they went dark. That's what people can't get past, not the draft decision. The contradiction. How do you go from full-on respect to absolute disinterest without even a sentence to connect the dots? And what that exposes is the brutal truth behind these public evaluations. Sometimes, coaches say what they're supposed to say. Sometimes, they're honest in the moment and circumstances change. And sometimes, maybe the worst-case scenario, they meant what they said, but never meant to act on it, because it's easy to say you like a player. It's harder to stand by that opinion when it gets inconvenient, when rumors swirl, when media questions start poking holes in your logic, when insiders ask why you passed if you were so high on him, that's where belief is tested. Not in the comfort of interviews, but in the decisions teams make when no one's watching. And Sanders never got that belief, at least, not when it counted. Because in the NFL, respect is cheap. Commitment costs. That's the line Tomlin drew, whether he meant to or not. His brief, cold comments didn't attack Sanders' character. They didn't disrespect him, but they also didn't protect him, didn't correct the record, didn't push back on the growing rumors or offer clarity. They just removed him from view, and that might have made sense from Tomlin's perspective. Coaches have to be locked in on their current roster, their next opponent, the next week, the next win. They don't have time to chase down narratives. And from a practical standpoint, Tomlin was under no obligation to say anything. But from the outside, the silence still felt personal. Because when a respected coach distances himself from a player in a moment where clarity could help, when he lets speculation live without challenge, the damage doesn't stay quiet. It shapes perception. In the locker room, in front offices, on shows, across social media. And over time, it defines players before they've had a chance to define themselves. That's why this situation never sat right with so many people. It wasn't about the pick or the non-pick. It was about how easily belief seemed to turn into nothing. About how a young quarterback who did everything right still got painted into a corner by silence that should have said more. And now, if Sanders wants to reverse that perception, he can't wait for words anymore. He'll need results. The thing about perception in the NFL is it never stays still. It shifts, it bends, it reacts, not to words, not to interviews or rumors, but to the one thing beyond manipulation: performance. And that's exactly where Shadour Sanders finds himself now. After all the questions, all the silence, all the unspoken tension, he's about to do the one thing that can force the entire league to reevaluate everything they thought they understood about him. He's playing them, the same team that met with him, sat him down, measured him, studied his film, admired his toughness, and then, one by one, passed, quietly but definitively. No clarification, no second look, no follow-up conversation. Just a final, unspoken message. Not for us. And now, he's getting his first chance to speak back, not through sound bites or headlines, but by doing the only thing that matters in this league: showing up and delivering between the lines. This isn't about revenge. If it were, it would have burned out months ago. This is deeper. This is about collision. Shadour Sanders is lining up against not just defenders on a field. He's facing a franchise that once debated his value in quiet rooms with closed doors and walked away like it never mattered. And now he has the ball. That's why this isn't just a game. It's a statement opportunity. Because matchups like this don't come around often. You don't always get to go toe-to-toe with the people who passed on you. Most players spend years trying to break through, only to face teams with no connection to their story. But this is different. This is surgical, direct, personal. The timing couldn't be more cinematic, but it's not scripted. No one planned this. No one scheduled the drama. That's what makes it real. That's what gives it weight. Because moments in the NFL don't wait for clean story arcs, they show up unannounced, disguised as just another date on the calendar, until you realize what it really is: a reckoning. And for Sanders, it carries all the tension of a defining moment, not because it will prove everything in one single afternoon, but because it won't need to. He doesn't have to throw for 400 yards, doesn't need 5 touchdowns and a victory lap. What he needs, what this game demands, is command, poise, intelligence, growth, not the surface-level quarterback stuff, the deeper stuff. The qualities Tomlin once complimented, the ones that supposedly set Sanders apart from the noise. If those qualities are real, they'll show up now. Not on a scouting report, not in a projection, on the field, in real time, under pressure. Against the very team whose silence helped shape the narrative he's now trying to outlive. It's not about being perfect, it's about being undeniable. Because when a player lines up across from an old decision, the goal isn't revenge, it's replacement. Replacing speculation with evidence. Replacing what-ifs with what is. That's what this matchup gives him. And to be clear, Pittsburgh isn't the villain. They're running a business. They took their shots. They chose their guys. That's what every team does. But make no mistake, when you sit across from someone the league said no to and you look like quarterback material, the doubts start shifting. And not just in that building, across the league. Because teams talk, coaches compare notes. Scouts double back when realities don't match the pre-draft reports. And if Sanders delivers in this moment, this exact moment, it won't just adjust how Pittsburgh views him. It rewrites how everyone else frames the entire evaluation. That's the avalanche effect the league never likes to talk about. Once a player proves he's been overlooked, every team that once agreed with that oversight starts quietly asking themselves the same thing: did we miss it? In a results-driven business, those are the kinds of regrets that tighten up scouting rooms and change career trajectories. That's why this moment matters so much. Because after everything, the praise, the passing, the silence, the rumors, the next play, the next drive, the next decision under center becomes the only thing people will remember. This game isn't just about Pittsburgh anymore. It's about every team that shrugged, every team that let doubt creep in, every insider who echoed something with zero proof. Now, Shadour Sanders has a spotlight he didn't ask for, but one he absolutely needed. He didn't tweet, didn't post essays, didn't clap back at the reports. He waited, worked, focused, prepped, and maybe that's what makes this whole moment feel so sharp. It isn't built on noise, it's built on patience. And now it's built on opportunity. Because you can't argue your way into belief in this league, you have to earn it. And sometimes the only way to earn it is to stare the doubt in the face and perform better than they ever imagined. That's how narratives flip. Not when fans tell stories. Not when reporters speculate. Narratives flip when a player speaks so loudly in silence that nobody in the building can ignore it. That's what Sanders is walking into now. One game, one field, one storyline, and complete control over how it ends. Pittsburgh may have been the most visible piece of the puzzle, the team who sat down with Sanders, praised him, and still walked away, but they weren't the only ones. 31 other franchises had the same opportunity. Different scouting staffs. Different systems, different philosophies, but the same end result. They looked at Shadour Sanders and moved on, every single one of them. And that's the part of the story that rarely gets discussed. The Steelers became the focus because of their proximity, because Tomlin's words were on record, because there was a face fans could attach the disappointment to. But if this were just about Pittsburgh, it wouldn't cut as deep, wouldn't carry the same weight. What makes this moment so significant isn't who passed. It's how many did, and how effortlessly it happened. Some teams justified it with needs at other positions. Some leaned into the idea that Sanders was NFL ready. Others probably didn't spend much time evaluating him at all, assuming he'd go later, or that the media hype didn't match the reality. Classic pre-draft thinking, safe bets, consensus boards. And yet, here we are months later with all of those decisions staring back at the people who made them, right as Sanders starts to crash through narrative after narrative. This is what the league never says out loud, but always respects behind closed doors: one moment, one performance, one unexpected breakout, and the entire room gets quieter. Because the truth about NFL scouting is that nobody wants to be the team that missed. It's not just football pride, it's organizational reputation. Front offices live or die by evaluation. And when a quarterback you passed on starts to rise, especially when you had the chance to take him and didn't, you start revisiting every note, every interview, every clip of film that somebody in the room raised a question about. That's the ripple effect. Sure, it's easy to say, we didn't need a quarterback. But every team's situation can change in a single season. Quarterbacks go down, stars underperform, coaches get fired. Suddenly, yesterday's not a fit becomes today's maybe we should have thought twice. Players feel this more than anyone. They know the system isn't perfect. They understand that evaluations aren't always accurate. But they also know that when consensus starts forming against you, silently or through whispers, it's almost impossible to escape unless you seize the one variable you can actually control, the moment right in front of you. And for Sanders, this moment isn't clouded by potential anymore. It's built on proof. He's showing composure, control, pocket discipline, awareness. He isn't flashing razzle-dazzle highlights every play. He's doing something far more dangerous. He's playing like he belongs. And for teams that let perception overtake projection, that's a headache waiting to explode. Because now this isn't just about if Sanders can succeed, it's about what version of him you ignored, how close you were to seeing it, how easy it would have been to take a chance if you'd paid a little more attention. If you looked past the name on the jersey, if you challenged the assumptions instead of chasing consensus. And that's where the NFL eats itself alive. General managers pride themselves on foresight. Coaches love being known as talent developers. But when a young quarterback rises outside your building, especially after you had chances to bring him in, there's no credit left to claim. No spin to apply. Just a quiet realization that someone else went first, and you let them. Sanders doesn't have to beat every team that passed on him. That's not how this works. His job isn't to keep score, it's to change the scoreboard, shift the tone, challenge the timeline set for him without ever saying a word about it. That's how the great ones do it. They don't react every time they're doubted. They don't flame out chasing validation. They reframe the story by being so consistently excellent that evaluation becomes hindsight, not prophecy. And right now, that's exactly where Sanders is headed. He doesn't need a viral post-game speech. He doesn't need to keep receipts on IG. What he needs is to do what the league didn't expect him to do this quickly. Command a huddle. Win respect. Make things harder for defensive coordinators each week. Stack performances that don't just surprise, they demand attention. Because once that happens, the narrative starts writing itself. And when those same scouting departments circle back on Sanders a few weeks from now, they won't be trying to figure out what they saw. They'll be trying to justify what they missed. Pittsburgh was just the tip of the story, the face, the quote, the moment that everyone clipped and shared. But behind them stood an entire league of organizations who made the same decision with different reasoning. Whether it was measured risk-taking, lack of belief, or just plain hesitation, they all passed. But he only needed one shot to show they all might have guessed wrong. And this is what that shot looks like. At some point, all the talk stops. The meetings, the evaluations, the polite soundbites, they fade. The rumors hit a wall. The headlines thin out. Even the whispers online lose power after a while. Because in the NFL, the only thing that lasts is what happens when the ball is snapped. And for Shadour Sanders, that's perfect. He never asked the league to believe in him. He never begged a team to see his value. He didn't try to outshout the narratives or tweet his way through the doubt. He just kept preparing, and now, with the lights on and history watching, all of that preparation has brought him here. To the only moment that matters. Not an interview, not a promise. A chance. A chance to flip history without saying a word. Because the thing no one tells you about the NFL is this: draft night might shape public perception, but it doesn't define careers. The league wants you to believe in finality, in the illusion that teams always get it right. But they rarely do. It's why undrafted players become all pros. Why third-round picks turn into Hall of Famers. And it's why a player like Sanders can still turn every passive no into a retroactive maybe we should've. And when that happens, the silence that once buried a player becomes the spotlight that follows him. That's the shift we're watching right now. Not revenge. Not even redemption. Something more precise. A redefinition, because Sanders was never dismissed loudly. He was respected, evaluated, complimented, but never truly chosen. And that's a quieter kind of cut, the kind that confuses more than it angers. Because when a team praises your grit, your leadership, your ability to command a locker room, then passes on you 5 times in one night without explanation, what are you supposed to do with that? You can't respond directly. You can't demand answers. You can't force belief. There's only one response that carries weight: take the field and make them watch. That's where Shadour Sanders stands right now, not in the shadow of rejection, but in control of the one thing those early evaluations never measured accurately enough: who he is under pressure. And now, the pressure is here. Not because this game defines his career, but because it reflects something bigger. For the first time, he faces a team that studied him and still turned the page. A team that quietly helped shape doubts across the industry by choosing not to follow their own praise with action. And whether they meant to or not, that choice sent a message, one that spread far beyond Pittsburgh's war room. They weren't alone in doubting him. They just became the symbol of it. But like most things in football, symbols only matter until the game starts. Then it's snaps. Then it's drives. Then it's decisions made under duress, with defenders closing in and no time to think about what someone said 6 months ago. In those moments, something else takes over truth, because pressure has a way of silencing spin. When play starts, no quote matters. No rumor can help or hurt you. The only thing left is execution. The stuff only real players have: vision, poise, toughness, leadership. The things Sanders' supporters always said he had, and the things so many others thought might not show up on Sunday. And that's all this moment is, really. Not judgment. Proof. If he shines, he doesn't prove the Steelers wrong, or the other 31 teams. He just proves that their evaluation was incomplete. That in a rush to project ceiling, they underestimated stability. In chasing arm strength and system fit, they misread demeanor. In trying to find the next star, they skipped over someone built for the moment in plain sight. That's what twists in the gut of every scout and executive watching now. Not that they said no, but how easy it was to say it. But Sanders doesn't have to fix all that with one game. He just has to own the moment. Because narratives in this league don't change with noise. They change with tape. And if he delivers on it, really delivers, then that so-called silence from draft night becomes part of the story, not the end of it. It becomes fuel. And it becomes a reminder to every other team watching that respect without action is just noise. And in the NFL, noise doesn't last. Performance does. Sanders won't need to point, won't need to tweet. He won't need to say anything after the final whistle. Because whether he wins or loses, if he shows he belongs, they'll all hear it, and they'll remember the night they watched a player take all the doubt, all the distance, all the silence, and make it obsolete. Not with anger, not with apology, with presence. Because in this league, belief is fragile, but performance, that rewrites everything.